Hello. Welcome back to the Space Gulag. We're going to find out what would have happened had Luke and Leia been raised by Grand Master Yoda. Before we begin, special thanks to our patrons, voice actors, everyone else part of my team. We don't have a giveaway listed right now, but there will be a new one announced in due time. Our story begins a moment after Padme's death. The sole hope of the galaxy felt like it had been taken away. While yes, the Jedi were gone from the galaxy, and yes, the Republic fell, something felt lost with Padme's death. When she died, it felt like the light in the galaxy died with her. It was something rather poetic, but tragic at the same time. Two babies crying, two Jedi Masters, and a senator from Alderaan. What to do? Master Yoda was the first Grand Master in nearly 3,000 years to watch his order fall out from under him. Master Yoda felt the pain of the order falling in his heart. How could he live with himself on his own actions? He allowed Anakin to fall into darkness, but not take closer care of him. Sure, the blame could be passed around, but he was the Grand Master. It was his responsibility, like it or not. Though he couldn't focus on his mistakes. They had come and gone. By the time Yoda realized that the Jedi needed to change, it was too late. But it wasn't too late for him to change. Yoda looked over at Kenobi, who asked him what they were going to do now. Yoda told Obi-Wan that failure was the greatest teacher. Obi-Wan had a puzzled look on his face, but Yoda told him that he was going to take the children to Dagobah. They would be hidden from the Emperor there. He would train the children in the ways of the Force, so that when they were ready, they could do what they needed to do and bring balance to the Force where their father could not. Yoda told Obi-Wan that he may do as he wished, but he did have training for him from his old master. Obi-Wan was a little confused, but when Yoda informed him that it was Qui-Gon Jinn, he understood. Well, kinda. Yoda informed him that Qui-Gon returned from the netherworld of the Force. He was able to actively communicate through the Force to the living. Obi-Wan nodded his head and pondered for a moment. Within an hour or so, the three would leave. While on the Tantive 4, on the way to their respective locations, they would pick up discussion from Polis Massa. Yoda would hold his ground, continuing to inform the other two that he was taking this mission because he believed he could do it. Bail wanted to take his daughter, believing that she would have a strong political voice, and while Obi-Wan was trying to figure out where his place in the galaxy was. He certainly couldn't go out into the galaxy without a purpose. He needed to strive for something. Yoda knew that Bail wanted the child for his own personal reasons, rather than a greater purpose, but Yoda saw that. While Bail wasn't a bad man, he knew that his wife wanted a daughter, and taking Anakin's daughter would fill that role for the two of them. Yoda, once they arrived over Dagobah, would take the shuttle he arrived in, with the nutrients needed for the children until he could establish a home for them and himself. He would depart from the Tantive 4, leaving Obi-Wan and Bail for their own respective missions. They had come to terms, and Bail would take Kenobi with him while he studied the Force a little bit more. And whenever Obi-Wan was ready, he could go out into the galaxy and follow the path that the Force set forth for him. When Yoda's shuttle landed, the children were both sobbing in tears because of the terrible sound the small vessel made upon entering Dagobah's atmosphere, not to mention the amount of pressure on the head when it came entering onto the planet's surface. Yoda took care of the children once the ship landed, until they were finally stopped crying. When Yoda turned around, he thought what he would do. He'd been to Dagobah before, and the last time he was here, he was warned of Order 66. He didn't believe it then, and he surely did now. Yoda looked around and found a small plot of land that could be used to build a small home. Yoda got himself together, and while the children were sleeping, he used the Force to help him construct a new home, taking apart different logs of trees with his lightsaber, building as much of a sanitary environment as he could. The biggest concern for Yoda was the possibility of either of the children having an infection of sorts. While for Yoda he'd be fine, the children were, well, children. Their immune systems hadn't fully developed. They were most vulnerable to creatures across the entire face of Dagobah, and there was no denying that. Yoda laid down a surface of wood that he would be able to take care of and actually keep clean. In the middle of the home, there was a little structure comprised of rocks and stones that would become a chimney. All laid nicely on top of each other, the stones we built with wet mud smushed in between. Yoda continued using all the elements around him until he was able to, after hours of hard work, construct the house that would be mostly complete. He sealed his ship up, because the capsule had heat and oxygen that filtered out whatever bad air Dagobah could possess. The vessel was actually placed inside of the home, because for at least a couple of months, it would suffice as a bedroom for the two children. Yoda laid it down long ways to ensure that it provided enough room, and also so that the ever-so-fragile children didn't accidentally roll over and delete themselves from existence. Life would be quiet for Yoda. He had a lot to unpack about not just himself, but the way he was going to teach. Yoda simply knew he couldn't train Luke and Leia like he'd trained thousands of students for the last 600 years. Yoda couldn't just rely on them following the code and expecting it to make sense. Even if it was simply the way that they were nurtured, the Jedi Code didn't function in the same manner as it did inside the temple as it did outside of the temple, especially not on a planet as deadly as Dagobah. The question remained as to why Yoda chose Dagobah, but the truth is, it was the only way for him to conceal the location of Luke and Leia without physically exhausting himself. Otherwise, the planet was an absolute nightmare to raise two children on. By the time the two children started crawling, they would become an immediate threat to themselves. If they wandered out too far, then a lizard could bite them and poison them, they could be gotten by one of the massive fish that could walk on land, or simply, they could be strangled by a hungry snake. The options were limitless to how they could easily end their own lives by accidentally doing so. Yoda, though, did a good job at filling the parental role he needed to fill. He took care of the children constantly and made sure they had healthy food, even it was from the ever so delightful delicacy that Dagobah offered. Regardless of Yoda's parenting habits, he was also rigorously working on himself, making sure that he as a teacher was more prepared than ever, if it meant he had to do a lot of self-reflection, even visiting back to in his mind's eye, the small temple on Ahch-To. The temple housed all the ancient documents of the Jedi, and yet for whatever reason Yoda felt compelled to abandon that ideology. Something Yoda knew, but didn't realize he had to still do, was learn the fact that failure was the greatest teacher. Sure, Yoda had taught that lesson several times over the past 600 years, and even more so was something that his teacher taught him. At least he realized it was still a lesson that he needed to learn. Because it was the greatest lesson. Indeed it was. Because without failure there was no learning, and yet had Yoda's perception become any different, he would have tilted into becoming a hermit on his own and becoming a failure of the Jedi. Yoda had to make the discernible choice of what would be right or wrong. Sometimes Yoda thought about it. Sometimes it haunted him. He had two choices. He could have split the children up and gone into hiding, and allowed Obi-Wan to have the Lars family raise Luke and leave Leia to the Organas, or he could have done what he was doing now. Though there was something that made Yoda struggle more than anything. It was his relationship with young Skywalker, and how it descended in the chaos so fast. The thoughts that stayed on Yoda's mind were hard to distinguish, partially regret, and part of it was destiny. All at the same time he felt melancholy over the entire situation. He could have saved Anakin, and especially because of having the two Skywalker children near him all the time, he felt Anakin's presence. The two children were simply combined would become greater than Anakin could have ever become, and it made their presence all the more difficult to deal with emotionally. Luke and Leia were something ever so rare in the Force, a dyad, and their power was so immaculate together that it matched the raw strength that only the Chosen One himself could achieve. Yoda dwelled a lot in the past, even while he could admit that it was contributing to his failure. While one must always accept what had happened and move on, Yoda simply couldn't. Nearly 10,000 Jedi died because he couldn't step in when he needed to. He did what he could for Ahsoka, and yet at every opportunity the Council had to ensure Skywalker could be saved, and they didn't. First, Yoda went back to the beginning of the war. He believed he was doing Anakin a service by changing the documents around, assigning Ahsoka to be Anakin's student instead of Obi-Wan's. Anakin seemed to enjoy that. Sure, thinking of Obi-Wan's death wasn't a great decision, nor was the betrayal of Ahsoka, though Yoda wasn't pleased with the choice either. He represented the voice of the Council, and he was one of 4 members that didn't vote for Ahsoka to be removed from the Jedi Order. The others were Obi-Wan Kenobi, Plo Koon, and Shak-Ti. Ahsoka didn't win the majority, but rightly so, Anakin blamed the entire Council for it. And when Yoda chose not to come back, she did what any Jedi should be able to do, and that's determine what the proper path of action is in a moment of emotional struggle. On the other hand, at the end of the war, Anakin seemed more irritable. There was something that changed in young Skywalker, especially after Ahsoka left. Obi-Wan mentioned it to him during a mission he and Skywalker had on Utapau, though Yoda must confess he had a moment in which he could have changed everything around for the better. It was a singular moment when he confronted Anakin about hearing Qui-Gon's voice on Mortis. Anakin seemed a little distant from the idea, and so Yoda let him be. But Yoda could have done something. He could have challenged Skywalker to have that conversation. And yet, before Yoda departed for Kashyyyk, he talked to Anakin about death. And while Yoda gave some sound advice, it wasn't what Anakin needed in that moment. While there were 100 reasons for Anakin to feel the need to turn to the dark side, what was done, and Yoda couldn't dwell on it. If he dwelled on it, then he was simply giving himself over to failure. He needed to focus on what he could do with the children. Yoda's plan was simple, and involved him teaching the children everything he knew about the Force, and ensuring that they were indeed ready to face down the Emperor, still unaware that Vader was alive. Yoda had one issue when it came to discussing their lineage. He would have to inform them at some point about their parents, and yet Yoda had no idea of how he would do it. But that wasn't of any concern yet, they were still infants. For several months, Yoda would continue his own personal training until tragedy. When the children were finally able to crawl and walk, they became a major danger to themselves, and Luke became a danger to himself when he stumbled out of the little home and was bitten by a poisonous snake. Yoda had to make sure Luke was alright, but there wasn't anything around him that he could use as an antidote. The truth is, only the strong would survive this. Luke was still an infant, and Yoda had to rely on Bail Organa getting from halfway across the galaxy to Dagobah with the antidote to help keep Luke alive. The waiting game would feel like a century. Of course, Yoda knew what it felt like to wait a century, considering he lived several of them. Yoda would keep the children together, and he would keep a constant watch over Luke, making Dagobah swamp rat soup with a powerful amount of protein that could be used to keep him alive. Of course, this for Yoda was a stressful moment, but when Bail Organa arrived, it felt like there was a chance for survival. A small vessel dropped down to the planet, and out came Bail Organa and a group of medical professionals. They immediately got to work on Luke and put him inside the shuttle, while working on making sure that he got rid of the poison coursing through Luke's system. Yoda sat quiet in meditation while the team got to work. Luke was very faint, his skin was very pale, and 83% of his blood was corrupt with the poison. Bail's team was the best on Alderaan, and they worked rigorously. As they put it, it was a miracle that he was still alive. Though it wasn't a miracle because Luke was possibly strong enough to stay alive. Though at the moment it seemed as if it was unlikely he would stay alive. It would take hours and several blood transplants to make sure that Luke would survive this endeavor. This would remove some of the essence of Force from within him. His power in the Force would diminish ever so slightly from this, and as Luke's natural body replenished itself, it would replace what was missing, though for now, Luke would be much weaker than his sister. When Bail finished up helping Luke, he gave Yoda crates worth of supplies full of new clothes, new cooking supplies, and everything else they might need along the way. Yoda was greatly pleased, and then he asked where Kenobi was. Bail didn't know. After a month of living on Alderaan, he said he was going to return one day, and then he vanished like a ghost. He hadn't had any contact with him since. Bail then informed Yoda that Ahsoka was still alive somewhere in the galaxy as well. He found her at Padme's funeral and spent some time talking to her before the clones arrived. Yoda was extremely relieved to hear that Ahsoka survived Order 66, and yet he was worried about the other Jedi out in the galaxy, especially Obi-Wan, though he believed Obi-Wan and Ahsoka were skilled enough to take care of themselves. Though before Bail left, he gave Yoda a small vessel that he could use whenever he needed if he wanted to get off-world and go somewhere else. When Bail eventually left, Yoda returned to his solitude before preparing to train the children. It would take nearly 2 more years until the children were of age to really start understanding anything. By this point, Luke had all of his essence in the Force back, and he was on par with where his sister was. Yoda still had a lot of waiting to do though. The best part for him was he was able to use his patience and work on himself so that he'd be a better teacher for when they were ready. Across the galaxy, Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi was working rigorously to help other Jedi stranded by Order 66. During this time, he learned that Vader didn't die on Mustafar, but during all of his attempts to find and kill Vader, he couldn't find him. Of course, Vader was looking for him, but it was a mere coincidence that the two of them didn't meet. In all actuality, it was the Emperor preventing the two of them from meeting. While he believed Vader to be a threat, he knew that with 2 years in the suit, he wouldn't be able to be a remote threat to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Sidious knew that Kenobi was a great duelist. After years of disrespecting the Jedi General, he now feared what he could do again to Vader. Though Obi-Wan was able to do something that he wouldn't have been able to do if he went into hiding. He was inspiring Jedi all across the galaxy. Because his name was so well known, and he was reported being seen, Jedi had hope. But they also knew that they should avoid any contact with the Sith. Why? Because they were under orders not to. Any chance Obi-Wan had, he informed them to avoid all confrontations with the Empire, especially with the Sith, because he knew that Vader would gain confidence if he was able to best the Knights and Padawans still alive. The Jedi to be spared instead of them going up and grouping up to fight Vader. They grouped up to help people instead. There were so many planets suffering because of the Empire. Serenna's capital was glassed and Count Dooku's palace was raided. On top of that, the Empire marched on Mandalore and destroyed everything. That one hurt Kenobi's heart the most, knowing that Satine would have saved her people from what happened to them. On the other hand, Obi-Wan was elusive like a ghost, spotted when he wanted to be seen, but living the life of a hero. He inspired people like Saw Gerrera to focus on the most important pieces to leading a rebellion. With Kenobi's guidance, he was able to help Saw see that there were much more important matters than trying to beat down the Empire every chance they got. It was a psychological war, and he couldn't be waging said war on the population of the Empire. Because of Kenobi's wisdom, Saw wasn't seen as an insurgent, but more so a liberator, especially since the clones were being phased out by the stormtroopers. Kenobi had heard rumors that many clones were dishonorably discharged for not obeying orders that Imperial officers gave them. This could simply mean an execution, which it normally was, or simply being kicked out of the military, which it rarely was. The clones struggled the most with the change into the Empire. While yes, many good soldiers did follow orders, they were people that had to live with those orders. People who served with Jedi and then killed those Jedi, only to undo everything they fought for in 3 years with the Empire. It didn't sit right with a lot of the clones, and rumor had it that a dispatched fist turned on him, though they were all subsequently killed and replaced by stormtroopers. Part of Obi-Wan's goal was that after he was able to save the Jedi, still lost in the galaxy, he would go and search for the clones that betrayed the Empire, and enlist them in his cause. Obi-Wan became a voice for the Jedi in the Outer Rim, and a little movement of both Jedi and civilians started called the Path. As it seemed, the Empire wasn't just interested in Jedi, but they were also interested in anyone with the ability to use the Force. While Obi-Wan was crusading across the galaxy in the name of justice and peace, Yoda began simple instruction with the twins. It was a little rough to begin with, but Yoda was able to use his intellect and skill as a teacher to work his way through to them. The children were, well, children, and they needed to be taken care of with great patience. Yoda used said patience while taking care of them, and it worked out in their favor. As the first couple years and adding up, the two of them were able to start understanding more and more, and then Yoda took them off-world for the very first time. It was at this point of which he believed they were ready to start learning about the Force. So, they went to the planet of Ilum across the galaxy, so that Yoda could get them to retrieve their Kyber crystals. Both Luke and Leia were the most advanced students Yoda had ever had the honor of personally training. While yes, he had Plo Koon, Mace Windu, and Anakin Skywalker in multiple classes, he didn't train any of those students on a one-on-one circumstance. It was all classes of which he taught those students. Once the trio got to Ilum, Yoda led them to the temple and told them that they must complete this leg of the journey by themselves. He would be here waiting for them when they were done. Luke and Leia walked with each other into the cave. As 6-year-olds, this was a daunting task. Though having been raised on Dagobah, the biggest challenge to the two of them was facing the extreme colds of the planet. Unlike the typical students of the Jedi who traveled here, Luke and Leia didn't have order-issued jackets that were warm enough to melt the ice of Hoth. Luke and Leia simply had Alderaanian winter jackets, which winter on Alderaan never got nearly as cold as summer on Ilum. Regardless, the twins went in and started searching the cave. Yoda, on the other hand, left the temple. When they landed, he noticed a crashed ship in the ice of the planet. It looked to have been shot down, and so he walked across the snow and got into the ship that once belonged to Professor Huyang, the robotic droid that used to help thousands of Jedi build their lightsabers for the greater part of a millennia. When Yoda walked inside of the ship, everything was offline. Yoda sadly found Professor Huyang destroyed, his parts ripped apart by what looked to be a lightsaber. Yoda frowned and continued walking, and as he got all the necessary parts, Yoda made sure he got enough parts so that they could change them around and make them larger when they got older. The particular hilts that Yoda got for them, though, were outfitted with the ability to change the length of the actual blade itself. This would come in handy when Yoda placed the materials into the vessel they arrived in, and then he returned to the temple and waited. Both Luke and Leia walked together. They trusted the Force, but the two of them didn't want to separate, and the pressure started to amount, being that the ice wall would soon freeze up, trapping them inside the caves for 19 days. Suggested that they try and split up to find their own crystals. Truthfully, Luke didn't want to do this. He preferred to be by his side through this entire process, but he agreed to do so because she suggested it. Yoda sat quietly, feeling every single choice the two children made on the inside, and yet they had made the correct decision. The Force was leading them in a way that they needed to learn. They needed to understand that while yes, they were powerful as a dyad in the Force, they needed to accept their roles as individuals within the Force. If they couldn't exist without the other, then they would truly be lost if they had to be separated. It was a great lesson that the Force gave openly to them. Not long before the ice wall fell, the two children came running out of the cave with smiles on their faces. They looked at Master Yoda with glee. They told him that they did it. Yoda smiled and asked what lesson they learned. They were strong as individuals, as strong as they were as a duo. The children smiled and walked with Yoda back to the vessel. They were both eager because they had both achieved their lightsaber crystals, and now they were taller than Master Yoda, which for children is a massive accomplishment. On the other side of the galaxy, the Jedi were faced with outrage. Jedi Master Kenobi had gone missing, and they knew where he had gone, and yet they didn't know what to do. The Jedi were being hunted down by the Empire. There were hundreds of Jedi Masters, Knights, and Padawans gathered up together. Kenobi saved hundreds of Jedi. One of the more notable Jedi was Master Sinube, who was on the planet of Raxus with all these Jedi in the path when the Empire arrived. The truth is, Obi bought everyone enough time to escape. The Empire had enlisted its Inquisitors, except they came down to Raxus with also Lord Vader. Obi-Wan knew what to do. He knew Vader would be blinded by vengeance and only focus on fighting him. If he would buy everyone enough time to escape, then Vader wouldn't notice. Obi-Wan gave Master Sinube the communication device to contact Master Yoda with if they needed him, but Yoda was on an important mission and made sure that Obi-Wan told that to Sinube. The truth is, the fight was going really well. 6 years into using his suit, Vader had only fought 3 or 4 Jedi. Each of those times he was able to easily defeat the Jedi because they were just lost Padawans. But when he faced Obi-Wan, it was a different story. Vader informed everyone that he would fight Obi-Wan alone, and then Kenobi began beating Vader. The Inquisitors tried to help. Obi-Wan was good enough to defend himself from some of the Inquisitors, but a trigger-happy stormtrooper set his weapon for stun and shot Kenobi. There was now a defining issue in the Imperial ranks. The Inquisitors saw that Vader wasn't as strong as he was made up to be, and the stormtroopers saw it too, especially since Vader's suit was ripped apart, not revealing his face that laid under it, but the breathing apparatus was heavy enough to be heard, and it was very broken. Overall, this was a very bad look for him. He couldn't simply just turn around and kill everyone here either. He was too wounded and too surrounded. He was defeated and embarrassed by Obi-Wan once again, but this time everyone saw it. Vader demanded that Kenobi be taken to Fortress Inquisitorius for questioning and torture. The Inquisitors did so as their master requested. By the time Vader got around to where the path was located, they were all gone. Obi-Wan made the ultimate sacrifice and every Jedi knew it. Not only did they know it, but the people knew it. It was an ignition of a passion, a flame if you will, for the people of a small rebellion. More people would come to learn about this and join their ranks. Yoda would be informed about it by Master Sinube, to which he would inform the Jedi Master that it would be by the will of the Force that Kenobi's fate would be sealed. Sinube was disappointed that Yoda didn't want to become seen, but Yoda knew the importance of Kenobi's decision. Not everyone knew that Yoda was still alive, only a few of the Masters, and of course Bail Organa. Obi-Wan's sacrifice to the larger group of Jedi had an immortal effect. It made them realize that even more than previously how high the stakes were for them to succeed. Kenobi's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain, and they all believed that to be the case. Because if Yoda just returned, it would ruin the immortal status of his sacrifice, so he didn't return. Instead of Fortress Inquisitorius, the Grand Inquisitor, along with Darth Vader, began their interrogation of Kenobi. Vader wasn't holding back. He made Obi-Wan's life a living hell, whether it be lighting his outfit on fire so that his body would burn up, or using drastically hot knives to scar his skin that had been previously burnt. Vader would use a constant technique of throwing Obi-Wan's biology off kilter. He would light his body on fire and then freeze a limb that was on fire. It sent Obi-Wan's physicality into drastically different directions, confusing all the makeup of his body into a painful array of suffering. Once Vader took a break, the Grand Inquisitor took over the torture, but he wasn't as vile as Vader was. Simple torture techniques that the Empire had created over the past 6 years. When Vader eventually returned, he used the Force to throw the Grand Inquisitor from his feet. Truthfully, Vader was pissed that the Grand Inquisitor wasn't torturing Obi-Wan as drastically as he had. The Grand Inquisitor looked over at Vader, who ignited his lightsaber and started walking up to Obi-Wan. Kenobi had been through it all, and he was barely staying alive. He was barely able to even function, and he looked ready to die. As Vader prepared to cut off Obi-Wan's dominant hand, he was thrusted into a great pain. The Grand Inquisitor was behind him, his lightsaber fixated on Kenobi. Vader cried out in pain as he ripped himself around, and the Grand Inquisitor ducked out of the way, before using the Force to unlock Kenobi's restraints, dropping him from the prison structure. Did he care for the Jedi? Not at all. But did he care for Vader? Definitely not. Vader was a fool, and the Grand Inquisitor believed he was detrimental to the Empire, sacrificing resources to focus on Kenobi when they could have stopped the entire path on Raxus. Vader began slugging around, unable to keep his balance. The lightsaber wound not just hurt his suit, but his physical body as well. Kenobi fell and his garments were shredded, and his skin nearly melted. He looked up and everything was foggy. He saw the blurs of 2 crimson blades moving around, but he couldn't make out what it was. The Grand Inquisitor then called over the loudspeakers, demanding that Imperial troops arrive at this particular location. Lord Vader had betrayed the Empire. Vader swung violently at the Grand Inquisitor, but he was all too weak. All the anger in the galaxy couldn't help him. The entire panel that helped his suit operate was dysfunctioning, and he himself was essentially mortally wounded. Obi-Wan heard the announcement and crawled out of the way, trying to find somewhere to get away to. Kenobi found a vent and cracked it open to sneak in on the dark side of the room. When he closed the vent, he covered his mouth. The vent was freezing. Truthfully, it was just room temperature, but to freshly burned skin, it felt like the tundras of Hoth. Kenobi had tears come out of his eyes from the pain as he heard more lightsabers ignite behind him and the sound of blaster fire ring out. The cries of men as they fought off the hulking Darth Vader. Obi-Wan could feel it in the Force. A lot of people were dying. Stormtroopers ripped a limb from limb as the Grand Inquisitor threw all the Inquisitors present at Fortress Inquisitorius at the Sith Lord. The 2nd sister died, the 8th brother was cut down, the 5th brother holding his own as the 3rd sister was dropped to her death. The 9th sister ran up and threw Vader from his feet with all of her sheer physical strength. Stormtroopers started landing shots on the back of Vader's suit as he cried out in anger. The agony was too much. All the pain went through his body as he killed some worthless life forms in his eyes. Vader turned around and used the Force to crush the bodies of the 24 stormtroopers gathered in the room, throwing them through glass walls and out of the torture chamber. Vader and started cutting away at him. Vader blocked the strikes as best as he could before another squad of stormtroopers started blasting away, clipping the back of Vader, to which he slammed his blade through the 9th sister before he could return to try and kill the stormtroopers. The Grand Inquisitor landed a final blow, cutting across Vader's neck and watching him suffocate on the ground. He was a former Jedi Temple guard at the Jedi Temple, but he wouldn't have come out victorious if he hadn't been in for the initial surprise. The Grand Inquisitor told the stormtroopers that Kenobi was free in the complex, demanding that they go out and find him and then bring him to him. While the Grand Inquisitor gave Kenobi the chance to escape, it was all a part of the plan. See, the Grand Inquisitor saw Vader at his weakest. He almost lost to Obi-Wan on Raxus. Now, Obi-Wan was weak to where the Grand Inquisitor could be seen as a powerful asset to the Emperor if he captured Kenobi by himself. It was all a part of a plan to gain more favorability with the Emperor, though Kenobi made his way down to the bottom of the complex and tried to keep himself steady. Obi-Wan knew that if he didn't fix this now, he could get a severe infection or just as easily fall into hypothermia and die. Yoda could feel Kenobi's agony from a galaxy away, and he thought about contacting Terrace Nube, but before he could, the children of Skywalker came up to him and asked him who died. Yoda looked at the children. Yoda wasn't really sure what they were talking about. The words, "who died," rang out throughout his ears, and yet he couldn't figure out who they were referring to. As far as Yoda knew, Kenobi was still alive, though they weren't exactly bonded enough with him to distinguish if he had died or not. On the other hand, maybe it was someone else, but who could it be? Yoda knew about Obi-Wan's sacrifice, but at the moment, no one knew if he'd escaped the clutches of Vader. The Skywalker twins were actually picking up on their father's death from across the galaxy. Maybe it was how their mother died so traumatically, and they connected to their father through the Force, or maybe it was simply the Force just worked in mysterious ways within their family. Regardless of what it was, Yoda decided he needed to work with the children to try and get a greater understanding of what it was that they were feeling, especially because it could possibly help him resolve an issue of some sorts. If the situation required his input or his assistance, then maybe it would be a sound idea for him to interject. So, Yoda had both Luke and Leia sit down inside of the hut in the living room area. He told them to close their eyes and focus on who had just passed away. The two of them sat down and closed their eyes. The Force transcended through them, and across the galaxy, all the way into Fortress Inquisitorius on one of the moons of the Mustafar system. Yoda watched a towering monster slain by those who served under him. It was an ambush that was expertly set. Yoda then realized who was inside the suit. It was the father of the children. Yoda couldn't believe it, but then he realized that Kenobi was missing, and he may have been safe. This left a lot of trouble for Yoda to uncover, hoping that Kenobi could use his strength to get off the planet. Inside of the fortress of Inquisitorius, Obi-Wan lay dormant in the underbelly of facility. He felt so disfigured and burnt, his skin was torn across his limbs and his mind was left awry. He felt Skywalker's presence disappear, but it didn't mean that he was safe from the Grand Inquisitor. The truth is, Obi-Wan knew that Vader was blinded by his rage for Obi-Wan, but it didn't mean that he saw the Grand Inquisitor's betrayal. Though it was the way of the Sith, how could the Grand Inquisitor not see this as an opportunity to grow within the ranks of the Empire? Sidious hadn't yet learned about the death of Skywalker, but he did feel it within the Force. Obi-Wan looked around, wrapping what little of his garments around himself to keep himself warm, as he pushed himself up the wall and gained some footing. Obi-Wan crept around the corner looking for a way out, and then he saw a couple of Imperial pilots walking towards him. This would be a perfect escape route, but TIE fighters didn't have hyperdrives. The Empire was so foolish for not including them inside of the TIE fighter, their main fighter. Obi-Wan looked around and found a little area to climb up to avoid the pilots as they walked by. Obi-Wan grabbed his arms and held them so that the burns and scars didn't rest against the cold metal of the corridor. Obi-Wan was in a lot of fear too, because he realized that if his open skin touched the metal, it could get stuck to the metal, meaning he'd have to rip it off. Another endeavor of pain he didn't really want to experience, especially how icy cold the bottom of Fortress Inquisitorius was. Obi-Wan heard more voices coming down the hallway. It was 2 Imperial officers. Obi-Wan wasn't sure if there was a Landa shuttle present on the base, but if there was, his best means of escape was through an Imperial officer uniform. An Imperial officer uniform while donning the beard of a Jedi Master. Obi-Wan jumped down from his little seam in the wall and used the Force to throw both of the Imperial officers to the opposite sides of the room. Obi-Wan looked down and grabbed the garments of the one officer who looked to be about his size. Obi-Wan replaced his outfit with what he needed and then searched around the base for any sign of a medical bay. He walked around keeping a stern presence as best as he could while doing so. It was very hard, his legs were very hurt, and his body ached like it had never before. Obi-Wan also knew that his beard would be a dead giveaway. Kenobi launched himself into an adjacent room when he saw a group of stormtroopers coming his way. Obi-Wan looked around, and it was his officers' quarters. Obi-Wan made his way to the mirror inside. He looked down at a little droid stationed at the sink and turned it on. The droid got to work and shaved his entire face, removing the classic beard of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan looked beneath the sink and found some Bacta patches and took all of them, laying them on the most injured parts of his body and letting the Bacta sink into his system. Obi-Wan also searched the medical drawer and found nothing, of course. Obi-Wan turned and caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror and chuckled, talking to his reflections, saying that Satine would have been head over heels by now. Obi-Wan smiled and turned around, feeling much better as a Bacta made his way throughout his bloodstream. Obi-Wan looked at his ID badge and then remembered the name as he left the room, walking like an Imperial officer, barging past anyone who walked in his way. Obi-Wan's officer uniform was very high-ranking, and so he had the authority to be anywhere he wanted to be. Obi-Wan was feeling really good and thought about sneaking into the intel room, but he didn't know where it was, and knew that if he were unfortunate enough to come across any of the Inquisitorius, then he would be in for a struggle. The Bacta surely helped, but it wouldn't have him at 100%, nowhere close. Obi-Wan decided it would be best to try and just escape the fortress instead. He was able to manage his way all the way to the hangar bay, to which he found himself an Imperial shuttle waiting. Obi-Wan stormed into it and walked up to the cockpit. There were 2 Imperial pilots sitting there. They asked him what he was doing, telling him that this was Lord Vader's personal shuttle. Obi-Wan asked them if they had heard the orders. They asked what he meant, and then he used the Force to rip them from their seats and throw them into the ceiling of the ship. Kenobi jumped up into the cockpit and raised the shuttle off the ground, flying it up into the atmosphere and jumping into hyperspace, escaping the Mustafar system. Inside of the fortress, the Grand Inquisitor contacted the Emperor, informing him of Lord Vader's failure. The Emperor was unfazed by what the Grand Inquisitor was telling him. The Grand Inquisitor continued by telling the Emperor that Vader's focus on Kenobi lost them the path and allowed countless other Jedi to escape from them on Raxus. Sidious did know about this, and he was furious, but Vader was his best agent, nonetheless, and now he was dead. The Emperor didn't know who it was that did it, but he did have his assumptions, because the highest-ranking Imperial officer on base reported to the Emperor that the Grand Inquisitor told the entire base that Lord Vader had betrayed the Empire. Coincidentally, this was the same officers whose uniform that Kenobi took. The Grand Inquisitor had no knowledge of this transmission, and the Emperor knew that, and he wanted to keep it that way. He had his own plans revolving around the entire situation, especially for the Inquisitorius itself. But Sidious wasn't stupid enough to fall for it, and neither was a true Imperial loyalist like the officer who found the Grand Inquisitor's orders suspicious, though there was something else plaguing the mind of the Emperor. While he was aware of Vader's demise and the betrayal of the Inquisitorius, he felt a change from a galaxy away. It was a change in the winds, possibly from the Jedi, but he wasn't really sure. It was a power greater than that of Skywalker himself, and so Sidious wanted to know what it was. His first conclusion was that it was the Mother, Abeloth herself. But the truth is, Sidious knew it wasn't her, because if it was, the presence from the Force movement would have given him chills. Sidious knew it wasn't her, and he had no reason to fret at the idea of it being her. It was something pure, some sort of pure energy that didn't seem as if it had been influenced at all. On Dagobah, Yoda made the children stop reaching out with the Force, because he realized that the amount of energy the children put into it would probably alert the Emperor, and he knew he didn't have much time to get the children away from Dagobah before the Empire arrived. Luckily, Dagobah was the safest place in this part of the galaxy, for now. It wouldn't stay that way for long, though Yoda knew that, and he knew that the children's training would have to pick up from here and continue on Dagobah. Yoda didn't want the children to enter the Dagobah cave system originally. It was rough for even him when he was in there during the Clone Wars, but Yoda knew at this point that the children needed to have a greater concept of the Force itself. They could train this by joining themselves with both elements of the Force here on Dagobah. It would be a way for them to recognize what the dark side and the light side each represented. Not that they didn't have an understanding of it at this point in their lives, having grown up here on Dagobah. The Emperor sent the Grand Inquisitor and the rest of the Inquisitorius out into the Outer Rim to find Master Yoda or whatever else it could have been that set off this alert in the Force. Typically, Sidious would have sent Vader to do this, but he was sending the former Jedi on a suicide mission. He knew that the Inquisitors would find Yoda, and they would be killed by him. It would be ironic, as Sidious would put it. That would be the Jedi who retreated from the Jedi Order to join the Sith to be slain by their own Grand Master. The singular Jedi every student inside of the Jedi Temple worked with. Poetry, irony, Sidious didn't know what to call it, but in his own mind, it was truly hilarious. He couldn't get over the joy of knowing that the Inquisitors would find Master Yoda and be killed by him, just so that he could come down and find the power in the Force that Yoda had and take it for himself. While Sidious had no reason to assume that it was Grand Master Yoda, he was one to assume that it was Grand Master Yoda. He believed that Yoda was simply toying around and accidentally presented himself to the will of the Force. Sidious wasn't far off of his assumption, though. On the other hand, Yoda sent Luke and Leia down into the caverns of Dagobah to truly experience the dark side of the Force for the first time. When they entered, they were both scared. Of course they would be. They were both 6 years old. When they went down, they were confronted with terrible visions of the future, visions that made their eyes shed tears, and from those tears were sprouted the seeds of a new beginning. While they didn't know what all this meant, in due time they would both come to realize the importance of these visions, and the power that they each possessed. Luke and Leia continued throughout their vision, and then stumbled out of the cave, running into Master Yoda. They looked at Yoda and he smiled at them, telling them that they had just taken their first step into a much larger world. Across the Outer Rim on Dantooine, a bunch of rebels were up in arms about the arrival of a Landa shuttle. That would be until a beardless Obi-Wan Kenobi would emerge from the ship. Instinctually, the rebels believed this to be false until Master Terasunube confirmed that it was the Jedi Master himself. They took Obi-Wan in and gave him a hero's welcome, all the while making sure that he was actually okay, taking care of his burns and scars, repairing his skin and sedating him so that he could make a full recovery. Obi-Wan found medical supplies inside the shuttle, and it was barely enough to sedate the pain until he arrived at Dantooine. The first thing Kenobi did was disconnect the ship from the rest of the Imperial database, so that he couldn't be tracked. The ship he brought to Dantooine was completely off the grid, and it was safe from the Empire, and so was the path. When Obi-Wan made his recovery, he informed them of a heroic tale that he endured, almost defeating Vader and then ending up on Fortress Inquisitorius because of a singular stormtrooper, only for Vader to be betrayed and killed by his own men. The Jedi had a lot of hope now. Because Vader hadn't been killing Jedi, and the Inquisitors were so ineffective at killing Jedi, there really were so many souls still alive and functioning on the path. Jedi Master Quinlan Vos was super happy to see that Kenobi survived, but didn't hesitate to pull on Kenobi's strings a little by joking about Obi-Wan's lack of a beard. Kenobi appreciated it more than he could actually ever put to words. But once Obi-Wan made his full recovery, he was ready to get back into the fight at hand. The Jedi were still working hard to overcome their shortfalls and stand up to the tyranny of the Empire. This tyranny was too much for them to handle, but they had their moments, glimmers of hope, where they felt like they could take out the entire Empire themselves. On Dagobah, Yoda was ramping up the training of the twins. He had been on this grind with them, and they were really working as hard as they could. Yoda pushed them, and they excelled because of it. The children respected Yoda because of his work ethic and how gentle he was with them. But much like Yoda, they could also feel the encroaching darkness in the galaxy that was slowly making its way for them. While Kenobi and the Path were hurting the Empire, the greater Empire itself was much too large, and it was currently marching through the Outer Rim, stopping at nothing to do the Emperor's bidding. Though the Path realized, with the Emperor out of the core, they could strike at the core and do some damage to the Empire itself. Though the Jedi didn't know where to go. They knew Coruscant was way too heavily guarded, and that would be a death trap for them. So they divided their forces up. Some of the Jedi would be sent to Wayland, some of them would be sent to Naboo, and a number of them would be sent to Corellia. The main plan was to gather the most intel they could, and then return to Dantooine without losing anyone. The Jedi would find Mount Tantus on Wayland, they would find a young girl who was extremely powerful with the Force on Naboo, and on Corellia they found what they expected, the Imperial war machine in production. The Jedi took the little girl from Naboo. She was a fiery young redhead, and she was very obviously tortured by Sidious to use and focus on the dark side of the Force. And so the Jedi would try and help her the best they could, because they didn't know what else to do. They couldn't just leave her. The Jedi's main concern was what the Empire was constructing on Wayland inside of the Imperial facility. As months dragged on, with the Emperor scouring the Outer Rim, he would eventually find the essence of what he was searching for. The remaining Inquisitors found Yoda stationed on Dagobah. Yoda sent out a distress signal informing Kenobi that Sidious had found him. The transmission cut off from there. Kenobi immediately left with the best of the best, with the intention to help and save Yoda. The rebels had some starships, nothing much but maybe enough to rescue the former Jedi Grand Master and the Skywalker twins. On Dagobah, Yoda was shooing Luke and Leia away from the Inquisitors as they tracked down the Jedi. Yoda hopped through the air, cutting them down one by one as the Emperor arrived on the planet. His presence turned the forest into night and the swamps into death itself. Yoda feared for the children as he ushered them away, defending them from the Inquisitors, who died one by one at his hands. Sidious's guard followed him as he slowly followed the Jedi Grand Master. The Grand Inquisitor tried his best, but he was the final Inquisitor to be cut down. Still alive, but cut down by Yoda. The Sith Lord looked over at the Grand Inquisitor and shot lightning into him, killing him slowly before turning to Master Yoda and asking him if he believed the children would be saved from him. Yoda nodded his head and leapt forward. Sidious ignited his lightsaber and dashed into combat with Yoda. The two old masters of light and dark fought endlessly on the battlefield of the swamp. Naturally, Yoda had the advantage because he knew the area better than Sidious, but this did not matter to the Dark Lord of the Sith, who used the Force to throw Yoda from his feet. Sidious cackled, demanding his guard take the children to his personal shuttle. Luke and Leia cried out as they looked at Yoda being electrocuted to death on the swamp floors of Dagobah, shouting in agony under the cackling of Sidious's laughter. The Dark Lord watched Yoda lay on the ground, and he could feel the presence of more Jedi coming, so he decided that they would find the dead Grand Master and no children of Skywalker. Sidious drove his lightsaber down into Yoda's little chest, extinguishing the life of the Grand Master before he departed. Hours later, the Jedi would arrive to find no children and the death of Yoda. Their hearts would be saddened, but it would be at this moment they knew they needed to retrieve the children. They had to believe that Luke and Leia were strong enough to handle the dark side of the Force. If they weren't, then they would become agents of evil. Luke and Leia were 7 years old at this point, and they needed to be stronger than anyone else in the galaxy. They told Sidious that they wouldn't do anything for him, and that they would never betray the light. Sidious just laughed and told them that he didn't need them to listen to him. He just needed them for what they could do for him. Sidious fed off their fear and laughed quietly, as the brother and sister sat next to each other closely, trying to whisper to each other about what Master Yoda had taught them. Sidious noticed this and demanded his guards separate them from each other. Sidious would take the children back to Coruscant, to his throne room inside of what used to be the Jedi Temple. Sidious would come to learn about Mara Jade being captured by the Jedi, and he really didn't care. He believed this would be a fair trade in his eyes, the children of Skywalker, for some no-name girl with the possibility to not even become half of what either of these children could become. Of course, that was far from true, but Sidious loved to put down Mara Jade because he was angry that Vader couldn't have been in her position and raised by him in the ways of the dark side of the Force. Regardless, Sidious had two plans for the children, and depending on how the children acted, decided their fates. When the Jedi returned to Dantooine, they realized that they had an issue on their hands. Of course, they could give Yoda a proper burial, but there was a bigger issue at hand, being that Luke and Leia were no longer safe. They were in the hands of the worst, most vile Sith the galaxy had ever seen. They needed to be strong, while the Jedi figured out a way to get to Coruscant and save them. On Coruscant, Luke and Leia were being introduced to pure evil itself in the form of Emperor Palpatine. He was cruel to them, and he tried to subject them under his rule, though they weren't really buying into it. They believed he was acting like a goofy old man, and truthfully, that really bothered him. Sidious knew the children weren't taking him seriously, and it really aggravated him. But Sidious knew he couldn't just torture them. They were resilient, and they wouldn't break the torture. Hence Palpatine's second plan, which revolved around taking them to Mount Tantus and making them suffer for the rest of their miserable little lives. Though he wanted to see if they'd actually be suitable replacements for Mara Jade. Luke and Leia had a plan themselves, and it was mostly instructed to them by Yoda, but the rest of the plan came to them from their joint vision on Dagobah, and they decided that they would play the Emperor. They fooled him enough, and now they would pretend to serve him in the way that he wanted them to. Palpatine would fall for the rules, momentarily. Of course, this process would take weeks, and because Luke and Leia were exposed to the dark side of the Force by Yoda on Dagobah, they were ready when Sidious forced it onto them. Though after weeks of torment and separation from each other, both Luke and Leia began to lose hope. That was until the voice of the late Grand Master found them and spoke to them. It was Yoda that kept Skywalker's twins grounded. Sidious had no knowledge of this, considering death was a concept invented by the Jedi, and he didn't know that Yoda was able to communicate to the children from the afterlife. The Skywalker twins grew a lot from their short stint with the Emperor, because they harnessed everything that he taught them, but they didn't get controlled by it. Though after a few weeks, they were almost broken to their core. Palpatine was getting through to them, and his forceful nature was causing the twins to fear what they could no longer resist in the dark side of the Force. And when they were awoken by Palpatine's guard and brought into the training facility inside of Palpatine's throne room, the children were ready to fail. The children were woken up like this on a daily basis ever since their arrival on Coruscant. The moment they looked at the Sith Lord, they knew it was over for them. They knew they no longer could do this, and they looked across at each other from across the room, and feared the idea of becoming servants to the dark side. Sidious was so pleased with himself, and he continued forcing the children to do his bidding. And then the wall exploded open, sending the royal guards across the room. Palpatine too was thrown from his feet, as 5 Jedi Masters piled into the room, igniting their lightsabers and running down after Palpatine, while a couple of rebels got a hold of the children and made sure they got inside the vessel. The 5 Jedi moved forward. Obi-Wan, Oppo Rancice, and Coleman Kaj were the only 3 Jedi Masters remaining from the High Council, and they swung forward while Tara Sinube defended the children and Quinlan Vos tried his best to keep up with the other 3 Masters. Master Rancice was very old, but he moved very well, especially with the other Jedi with him. Sidious was completely blindsided, and he didn't actively carry his lightsabers because, well, why would he? What reason would he have to do so? And only now did he realize the issues with his decisions. Sidious shot lightning as a defense, and the Jedi moved to defend themselves, but the truth is they were too sparse to be stopped by Sidious in one move, and so they swiftly cut through the Emperor, killing him. The Jedi quickly made a retreat, and instead of leaving the planet, their vessel ran along the bottom of the city until it could enter the lower levels of the planet itself. The Jedi would hide out down in level 1313 for about a week and a half before they used public transportation to bounce off-world. One would think Oppo Rancice would be a hard sight to miss, but the Jedi used a cargo vessel, not a passenger vessel. From their destination, they would hitch a ride to Dantooine. The Empire was in another galaxy. Of course, the trouble for the Empire was the loss of their Emperor, but the Empire was far from fragile. It was 7 years into leadership and had established a regime built on military power, and came in 2 phases from the Imperial military to pick up the slack. The Emperor's loyalist and Grand Moff Tarkin, who would swoop into the Imperial Senate like the Angel of Death, would announce himself as a new emperor of the Empire. The Imperial Senate didn't actually see an issue with this. Tarkin was frequently seen by Palpatine's side, and so they believed that this is what Sidious would have wanted. Truthfully, Tarkin took a hold of the role of Emperor and began to set a contingency plan that the Emperor would have wanted to be enacted. The contingency requested that his body be sent to Mount Tantus for reconstruction and resurrection. On the other hand, Grand Admiral Thrawn would be taking up the mantle as leader of Imperial militaristic operations. As for the rebels, they would retreat into silence. Without Yoda, Obi-Wan realized that Luke and Leia were the future of the Jedi, and so he brought together the collective minds of Tara Sinube, Oppo Rancice, Quinlan Vos, and Coleman Kaj, of course, and himself, to take up the training of Luke and Leia. Little did Obi-Wan realize the significant impact that Yoda had on them from the afterlife. While the galaxy would face turmoil under the new reign of Tarkin, the years would creep by faster and faster. Tarkin also had no access to Force users. The Inquisitores were gone, and as for the Sith, other than Maul, were essentially extinct. And in 10 BBY, the Crimson Dawn would be completely eradicated by the Empire. Maul would go into hiding, but the only hope he had for anything was pretty much extinguished as he lay in waste on Malachor. The training of Luke and Leia would extend from the Force and lightsaber combat into their excellent ability to pilot starfighters, passed down from their dear old dad, of course. The pilot training was suggested by Kenobi, obviously, knowing how much Anakin would have wanted to teach his own children how to fly. It was like integral to knowing Anakin, and none of the other Jedi Masters knew why Obi-Wan was so focused on teaching the Skywalker twins how to fly. But Luke and Leia were so incredibly talented as pilots, and when they reached their late teens, they were some of the best the Rebellion had to offer. Though by this time the galaxy looked much different. Tarkin cracked down on the Empire much faster and much harsher than Sidious did, and so incidents popped up faster than they would have otherwise. Lothal had a successful rebellion without the death of Kanan Jarrus due to his serving with the Jedi in the Path, though because of the Ghost Squadron they were able to deliver the rebels a new Jedi in Ezra Bridger, a young boy who would begin training with Quinlan Vos. On the other hand, Ferrix and Aldhani were making headlines galaxy-wide. The rebellion was very present, and the Empire was ready to silence them. Tarkin had no issue silencing Thrawn and forcing the TIE Defender program down the exhaust shaft, though there was an issue. Tarkin's focus on the Death Star, and his excommunication of Director Krennic, he forced the project to be complete way before it was ready. Tarkin was going to test the Death Star on Dantooine, even though it was obvious the rebels had left this planet years before. Tarkin gathered the entirety of the Imperial military force for the test. Thrawn, Yularen, Piet, Gideon, just a few of the talented great Imperial officers present on the starbase. Tarkin was so incredibly proud of his project, especially because the restitution projects for Palpatine weren't exactly going successfully. So Tarkin really needed this to be a show of his effectiveness as Emperor, especially since he was planning on dissolving the Imperial Senate not long after. So, with the best of the Empire gathered, they ignited the full reactor blast over Dantooine, and instead of detonating the planet, the ill-constructed Death Star ripped itself apart from the inside out and shattered, destroying the entire support fleet station next to it and creating a catastrophic, apocalyptic event for those who lived on Dantooine on the remote planet itself. The Empire would try its best to cover this up, but the incident was so widely known that it eventually reached the public, and it revealed that the Empire had built a superweapon that could destroy planets, only for the Empire to arrogantly self-implode on itself. There was a lot of issues with this. A lot of people died in the Death Star blast. Several families lost family members, and that was kind of an issue. Secondly, people didn't like the idea of just blowing up planets. Truthfully, had Tarkin allowed Krennic to oversee the production of the Death Star, the only real issue they would have had was an exhaust port. But because Tarkin got rid of Krennic, he also got rid of Galen Erso, the chief officer ahead of the Death Star's production. The Empire had a complete power shift. With Tarkin gone and the revelation of what he was up to, the Empire caved in, and all it needed was a little push. That push was led by the rebels, and the name that many during the Clone Wars knew so well. Skywalker led the rebellion against the Empire at Kuat in a surprise attack. The attack wasn't to take over Kuat, but to disarm the weapons of mass destruction. The idea was fronted by Leia. She believed that the people, if they saw the rebels disarming the Empire, would see it as an act of defiance towards a way of life that demanded terror. She believed that people would see this act as resilience, as strength. And so, when the rebellion attacked, they busted through the lines of the Imperial destroyers and landed critical hits across the Kuat drive yards. This move was a hit and run, done solely with starfighters, and so the Golan platforms and star destroyers couldn't do anything to stop the rebel advancement, because ion cannons don't tend to hit starfighters too well. The rebels jumped in and jumped out of hyperspace, though truthfully this wasn't the biggest concern from the Empire. Sure, the name Luke and Leia Skywalker would make headlines, but the Empire itself was turning on itself. Instead of a galactic civil war, it was an imperial civil war, created by the power vacuum and the lust for power that several imperial officers had. Without any central government, thanks to Tarkin's disabling of the Imperial Senate, there was no one who could grab the reins and slow down the crumbling of the Empire. Now, to preface, the Senate wasn't actually dissolved, but per Palpatine's plan, Tarkin whittled it down so much that it was more so a state figure with absolutely no power, ironically. So, with no power, the only power that could be achieved was through military strength, which worked really favorably for those with a large fleet. But when Imperial fleets tore each other apart, Rebel fleets were able to sneak in and take out the remainder of the troops. A year and a half after the destruction of the Death Star, the Skywalker twins would lead an invasion of Coruscant. Under their leadership, a united rebellion, funded by parts of the Empire itself, would take back the capital of the galaxy. Because of this Imperial Civil War, the Empire would be crushed, and no remnant would be able to retreat from it. The Imperial Civil War also saw the destruction of many key institutions that Palpatine was reliant on for his resurrection, including the destruction of Mount Tantus. The Skywalker twins would return to being Jedi. With the few hundred surviving members of the Jedi Order still alive from the Purge, the Jedi Order would grow anew. It would be tough to be rebuilt, but it would find its way. And as for the galaxy itself, it would take time to recover from the era of the Empire. But the era of the New Republic would bring in a new era of elongated peace. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Jonathan, Pimp Daddy, Bane, Darth, Cheesy Apollo, Madman Excuse, Anakin 003, Lemon Knight, Flamepin Cease, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. Hit 2,000 likes in this video. I don't know what's coming next, but it really is. If you want to see a what if, let me know below. I'll read out comments, but I'll do a crossover. Check out the Twitch, community Discord, and Patreon if you want to support me in other ways. If you want to get some merch, go to the merch store. It's down below. And otherwise, let's talk about our story. So yeah, Yoda trains Luke and Leia, and I killed him. Why did I do that? Well, it's interesting. It's a change of the dynamic of the train stories. We've done several train stories, and yes, I've done probably, like 160 stories, like 30 of them are train stories, and so I wanted to add a different dynamic to it. But also, the butterfly effect. Obviously, each of these stories has to have a butterfly effect, unless I'm doing What If Deppa Didn't Die, which you guys loved so much. But, like, in all seriousness, the butterfly effect in this story is simply, like Vader's death, for example. That I know you guys weren't fond of that, but, no one's invincible, and that's something that I always want to preface. It's like, I always want you to be on the edge of your seat, and obviously, not everyone would fall for the Grand Inquisitor saying, "Oh, Vader betrayed the Empire." Like, someone would be like, "Yeah, that's kind of sus." This guy vented, do some Among Us memes and all that. But, yeah, I wanted the story to feel unique, and I always want all the stories to be unique. Yes, so technically the story is about Luke and Leia, and should technically revolve around them. But I changed that dynamic kind of in the middle of the story because I thought it would be a more interesting take to kind of widen how much of an effect that having them trained by Yoda would have, right? Because the Empire is clinically stupid. That's the truth. The Empire is stupid, and we've seen that throughout everything ever. They're just clinically dumb. They're really bad at being good. And yes, I know during Andor and, the 20 years before the destruction of the first Death Star, they're pretty good at doing that, but, I think the thing I'm really trying to say is, the significance of Palpatine. Palpatine really keeps it all together. He's the glue that keeps the Empire together. Without Palpatine, it kind of falls apart. And that's kind of what I'm going for. You see it in Rebels when, people try to defy Thrawn. They're like, "Oh, well, I'm cool and you're not." And then they move a ship slightly to the left and, everything goes wrong because of it. That's literally this all the time, ever. And so I think Tarkin, he would get a little arrogant with the Death Star project, and I think removing Director Krennic would seriously harm the project. And so that was what I was kind of going with, was the ineptitude of Tarkin as well. Because, yes, he's a loyalist to Palpatine, but he's not Palpatine. He's not, he's not calculated like Palpatine. Yeah, sure, he's going to be all on board for, let's build a Death Star, but he's not going to be able to accomplish it in the same means and same patience as Palpatine. Now, something about Luke and Leia. I didn't want to make the main characters an ex machina. I know that's something that they technically wouldn't be, but every story, especially with Skywalkers in it, Anakin, Luke, Leia, whatever. I don't want them to always be an ex machina, and I think that's kind of expected. And let me explain that from a narrative perspective. Is that I don't want the story to be predictable. I want you to come into a story and be surprised at the end. You can say it's subverting expectations, what have you. The truth is, every story I want to be unique. As I said, we've done 160 plus stories on this channel in a year, and I want to strive to continuously be unique. And I always want to strive to be a better writer at the end of the day, so that you guys can get the best content from it. And so, removing Luke and Leia from this position where they both blow up the Death Star, because I think that's something that someone would have expected, I almost went that direction too. I almost had them blow up the Death Star, but I was like, that's too predictable. What if the Death Star just blew up because Tarkin rushed it? And I was like, that's actually kind of hilarious. And so I went with it. And that's, I want the story to not be predictable. Yes, Luke and Leia are the heroes at the end of the day. Yes, they go into the Jedi Order and they become these great legacy characters in the Jedi Order in the future, but the Empire crumbles because of its own ineptitude, not necessarily per se because of Luke and Leia, but Luke and Leia are pivotal in making it crumble, if that makes sense. And so I always want to strive for, that uniqueness in a story, the uniqueness for a viewer like you. It's like going into a movie without, going on Twitter and being spoiled, like, oh, all this stuff happens, And so I want you to come into the story like, you might have your expectations and, I might subvert your expectations, but I really hope that you gain something new from the story rather than, oh, I saw that coming from yesterday. It's like, that's not fun. That's not storytelling. That's just repeating cliches, and that's not entertaining for either a viewer or the writer, as myself. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. Anyways, next video is coming out whenever. I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.